Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Walsh, and today's discussion is based upon her book titled The Origins of Early Christian Literature. I have the link to purchase her book in the description below and in the pinned comment in the live chat to the History Valley Amazon affiliate link so you can go get her book. And with that being said, welcome back to the show, Robyn.
Thanks for having me. We were just saying it's been a while, so it's nice to be back. Nice to see you. So thanks for having me on.
Of course. So I'd like to start off with, how does one demystify Christian literature?
That's a great question. I like that a lot. I mean, the first thing is to understand that it's not in a vacuum, which I think is been a huge problem for the history of interpretation, because I mean, there are lots of reasons for this, but one I'll point out just to start with is people who were doing the critical study of the Bible in the past were usually from a faith-based perspective, and nothing wrong with that, except that it sort of created a box around what seemed possible in terms of evaluation. So one thing you see repeatedly, and one place I actually have seen this more often than not, is in something called the Loeb Classical Library, which is this collection of interpretations of a variety of literature, Gospels excluded. But Greek and Latin literature, there are these little green and red books, and these were top scholars, classicists in their fields. And if you read the intro to some of these texts, occasionally you'll see somebody say something like, wow, this particular motif or this theme or this phrase or this kind of phrasing in the text sounds an awful lot like what you find in the Gospels, but that can't be. And then you would see the scholar kind of just move on. And I think this was on both sides of the coin. I think New Testament scholarship would tend to recognize that there were certain motifs, or even, we've talked about the empty tomb before, aspects of the narrative, especially of the Gospels, of the story of Jesus, that looked an awful lot like you would find in other literature of the age, but it seemed impossible to assume that Christianity could, not be wholly unique. I'll put it that way. So I think that to demystify Christianity, you have to really be very sober-minded and try to be as objective as you possibly can about what we know about ancient literary practices and who's producing the Gospels. We have this traditional idea that the Gospels are really reflecting oral speech. And while that may be part of what's written down, it's still the case that literacy was so limited that there are only a certain number of people, really, in terms of percentages, quite low, who could produce the kind of literature that the Gospels represent. And all writers are constrained by genre, by certain expectations within literature. That can be audience expectation, but it can also be the expectations of the world that they're in as writers. So you're expected to conform to certain kinds of standards. You're expected to communicate in ways that are familiar to your audience. In other words, you're going to say something like the empty tomb to possibly indicate that Jesus has risen, or that he is now a god, or that he's experienced some kind of apotheosis. And that's the kind of thing you would see across literature of that age too. And it's not a threat, but as much as a descriptor, a way to describe something that's taken place that everybody who reads the text would understand. So these writers are constrained by genre, by expectation. They're also constrained a little bit by their own desire to be read, to be respected. And so they're going to engage in certain kinds of tricks of the trade in order to show off the fact that they're good writers. And all of that takes place in the Gospels too. So if we can do a good comparison of the Gospels to related literature within their time period, if we can understand that they are writing, that they're possibly more culturally elite than we typically tend to assume, not just recording oral traditions. And if we can really think about ancient Mediterranean writing practices more generally and book culture more generally, I think we get a little bit closer to understanding the limits and limitations of the Gospels, as well as their potentials in terms of imagining them in different ways.
What is a classic?
Well, that's also a really good question. It's something that is a moving target to some degree, and we have to think about what time period are we talking about. In antiquity, a classic would be something like Homer. So this is something that everybody would have been familiar with to some degree or another, that would have been taught in schools. In fact, to the extent that we have some school exercises that still exist. And sometimes, they were written on things like wax tablets. So not as much of this exists as we would possibly like. But people would learn off of things like Homer, or maybe some of the other quote unquote Greek classics from the Roman perspective. Somebody who comes to mind for me is Euripides. And so those texts become almost like we might use the word canon. They become the texts that are quite shared across the board. They're foundational for the way people learn, for discussion, and for kind of setting a literary standard. In modernity, we also think about the classics in terms of Greek and Roman stuff. We sort of lump these things together. And similarly, there are these occasional revivals, and especially within the university system and within, so we might call it kind of bougie and intellectual culture, the Greeks and Romans tend to come back now and again. And so when you think about the classics now, I think you still think about Homer, you think about Plato, Aristotle. Probably we would add Virgil to that, but these are the texts that have survived, that have passed on, that are deemed representative of a certain moment, we might say, culturally of the past, but also I think they set the foundation for how people have learned and, aspects that they have replicated over time, both in terms of conversations that we have, but also, again, setting the standard of some sort for high expectation of literature.
And how does one determine that a particular piece of literature falls within the genre of elite literature?
That's a great question too. You're really knocking it out of the park today. For me, elite is not necessarily economic, although I think that people tend to think that. I think that's kind of how the word functions in modernity to some extent, at least in this moment. But for me, elite means more rarefied. And that's not just about money, but that's about access. And so in the book that you mentioned, what I discuss is a term called, or a phrase, terminology, elite cultural producer. And I borrow that term from a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu. And when he uses it, he means it again in that sort of a narrow field of people who have access to something in particular. And so elite cultural producer, or elitism in this case, is back to that stat that I was giving you earlier about who's literate, who's able to read and write at the level of actually producing literature in antiquity. And so in that case, you're talking about just a tier of society that has access to these things that not everybody has access to. And in that case, those sort of invisible barriers create a sense of being elite and being engaged in sort of those elite conversations. The reason that I don't equate it with money necessarily is because, and Canada Moss is somebody who's written a wonderful book that was released, I believe, in March called God's Ghostwriters on this subject, which is that we know that many people who were writers in antiquity, and I mean this in a couple of ways, but they were enslaved. And that's because the labor of actually writing, producing a book, etc., was usually given to scribes of some kind or other enslaved workers. So even some of these authors that I mentioned as part of the classics or of canon, they dictated their work. This is Moss's argument in part. To people who were likely enslaved, who then produced the writing, copied it for them. And so I would include those people within this category of elite cultural producers, because they are actually producing this elite product, right? So it requires a little bit of flexibility to think about elite in that case, but it does mean access to a more rarefied set of practices.
Who are the primitive Christians?
I don't like that term. Can I talk about that for a second?
Sure.
So I don't like, so the primitive Christians are supposed to be, from what I've read, especially around 19th century German scholarship, are these very early Christians. You could maybe even use these terms interchangeably to some extent. And so when you talk about early Christians, you're talking about kind of this beginning of the movement that we tend to call the Jesus movement, or the earliest adherents who are considering themselves part of a Jesus group. And the reason I don't like to call these people primitive is I think that there are a lot of problems with that term in general as a descriptor, but also it tends to give this sense of these are very simple people, that all they care about is the logos, the word, all they care about is the spirit, that they're singular minded in that pursuit. And that even giving them that kind of idea of being labeled as one kind of whole, I think is a little bit smoothing over some of the cracks that we see even in the earliest quote unquote Christians documented, something like the letters of Paul. They are not that cohesive in the beginning. And so I don't really like this term primitive because I think it implies a lot about sort of the quality of thought of these people and the complexity. And I find that early Christianity, so-called, is far more complex, far more stratified, and less cohesive than we tend to imagine.
What do you think caused the early Christians to become immersed in Greco-Roman literature?
What caused the early Christians to be immersed in Greco-Roman literature?
Yes, like what was, or in other words, what caused them to want to write literature within that context, just a purely Jewish context?
So I have a theory on that might not be exactly what you would find if you read around, but it's something I'm working on right now, which is I think that you had in the 1st and 2nd century, especially under the empire, this increase of capital. So by that, I do mean economics, particularly among people who were not like the super rich people, not the native aristocracy of the Roman Empire. So people who were maybe like merchants before. I always think of Ostia when I talk about this. So people who were maybe, we might call them like upper middle class today, or middle class, who are able, because there is more connectivity throughout the empire, to make more money, more or less. So let's think about traders for a second. So somebody who might be a merchant or a trader, they're probably going to have more money now. And we see this reflected in things like, it's a little bit later, but Lucian, who's a satirist, but he'll make fun of certain people that are kind of too big for their britches, to use that phrase. You know what it means. Like people who are trying to aspire and look maybe wealthier than they are, or they are wealthy now and they feel like they have to embody it, right? So the equivalent today would be like wearing designer clothes or buying a Tesla or something like that. You feel like you have to show off the wealth. And you see this too in something like Trimalchio, which I think we've talked about before in the Satyricon. So here's a guy, he can't read, he can't write, but he has a huge library, and he basically collects books to look well read, to look kind of like a cultural elite, right? But in that different key where you're aspiring to what you see like the really richest of the rich doing, because you're wealthy now, that's what you're supposed to do. Now, the people who are super wealthy are the ones who are sponsoring the authors you've heard of. Virgil, right? So you have like the Roman emperor sponsors somebody to write an epic, or write a story about a god, or to write about the religious traditions that are, popular in the day. What you don't have, though, is the ability, as somebody who's not, again, native aristocracy, part of the kind of imperial family, you're not going to sponsor someone to write something in competition to a Virgil, right? Like you don't have that much money. You're not going to get a guy that good. But you might be able to sort of pick up on a religious tradition that is developing, or that's new, or that's kind of the new thing in town. And I would say that people were more curious about Judea in general. And I have written about this in some stuff that's already been published. But this idea that Judea is interesting to people because of that Jewish war, especially in the 1st century. because all of a sudden you have all these coins being minted that mention the captives of Judea. Many of the people who survived that war became prisoners of war and enslaved and sent out throughout the empire. You also had kind of this, almost, I would call it, perverse interest among the Romans. You see this in their art, their sarcophagi, statuary, with people who are subjugated to the empire. So you often see on sarcophagi scenes of battles where people are being basically colonized by the Romans and taken over by the Romans, or battles with, say, like the Germans or the Dacians who are, trying to resist Roman rule, basically getting their faces stomped on by horses. But there's sort of this, I think, attraction to the spectacle of that violence, but also people kind of felt bad, but also you were proud to be a Roman in those moments because you're showing the power and reach of the empire. So there's a lot of curiosity about Judea in the first century because of the Jewish war. Colosseum gets built, the Flavian amphitheater from the spoils of the sack of the temple. The Arch of Titus gets built from that. So it also brought a lot of wealth into the empire. So people are talking about it. They're interested in it. So when these stories, especially, Josephus writes about other so-called sons of God or, holy figures from that period in that region. So it doesn't surprise me too much that you might have that tier of, again, this sort of upper middle class, newly upper middle class people aspiring to act like what they see the empire doing, the imperial tier of society doing, by sponsoring someone to write a gospel about Jesus, right? And maybe they are affiliated with some kind of early Christian group at this stage, where, again, there's still sort of this formation period where, they're coalescing somewhat. There's some cohesion to these groups where people are kind of coming in and out. People are curious about it. They're curious about Judaism. We know this because of the holy books of Judaism. They're very, very ancient. People are very curious about them. So I think that confluence of things led people to be interested in that topic. And it's not too surprising to me that you see, especially in the Greek of the Gospels, it's not quite super elite Greek. I mean, like, it's not really, really good. It is Koine Greek, which is more common, but that's what you would expect somebody in the class that I'm talking about to be able to afford or sponsor. So I tend to think that something along those lines is the social model that, or one social model we might consider.
What kind of sources do you think the Gospels made use of? Do you think they used very specific Greco-Roman sources?
Yeah, I try to look quite often at, I'm trying not to reveal anybody else's work here that hasn't been published yet, that I've been reading on this topic. I mean, like, I've certainly, and others, have tried to identify parallels in literature between what we find in the Gospels and what you see as like trends and tropes, which we've already talked about a little bit. But I think, too, we know from, again, the limited information we have about school exercises and what people are reading in school. I mean, those become the models, I think, for everybody going forward. And so I think one piece I have forthcoming, so I can talk about it myself, is coming out in the Next Quest for the Historical Jesus volume that's coming out in November. And what I wrote about there is that there's something that is usually termed the Messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark. And what that is if you've read the Gospel of Mark, people will start to recognize Jesus or speculate that they think he's the Messiah. And as soon as he performs a miracle, gives a teaching, something like that, where people are like, hey, who is this guy? Or they're sort of bewildered by who he is, or they're trying to figure out who he is, Jesus will usually shut them down and tell them, don't tell anybody anything or go away. And so that tendency in the text where Jesus over and over again tells people to like, shut up, was called the Messianic secret by a German scholar. And I think he might have coined it in the 20th century, William Verda. And so that has kind of run for the last few generations as a theological explanation for what's going on in that text. That Jesus seems to think that as soon as he's identified or he confirms who he is, because he's the Messiah, he'll be executed. And so he's trying to delay that. That's one theory, or one aspect of the theory. What I argued instead in this piece that's coming out, it'll have a weird title. I think it's called City and Country, because they asked me to write about city and country for historical Jesus studies, but one thing I noticed is that you tend to have more miracles in the country in this literature, and then whoever goes into the city becomes either corrupted or dies. And I was looking at other philosophers for whom this happens in ancient literature. And it is kind of a trope also in the Greek novel that, everybody's happy in the countryside, but as soon as you go back into the corrupting city, things go wrong. And so what I argue there is that that's what you see in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is in the countryside in Galilee. He's performing these really miraculous events, or producing these miraculous events. People are bewildered. The word in Greek is thauma, wonder. So he produces these wonders and people are bewildered. Some of them almost go out of their minds. They can't process what they're seeing. They don't know how to handle it. They're completely confused, right? Messianic secret. Who is this guy? What is he doing? What's going on? And so this continues until he goes into the city and then he's recognized. But that thauma language is something that you also see in Homer. And you also see in Virgil, the misrecognition of the hero, that everybody keeps misrecognizing the hero while he's performing his deeds or when he marches in and out of town, or her, because I also bring up Camilla from Virgil. But when people see these characters in the text, they're completely bewildered. The thauma language is usually used. They're confused. They don't know who they are. They don't know how to process what they're seeing. These people are a subversion of expectation, particularly in their deeds or how they look. And so I think that the author of the Gospel of Mark, who doesn't always get a lot of credit because the Greek is a little bit abrupt and sort of simple language, he uses this thauma language everywhere. And so what has traditionally been called the Messianic secret, I think could maybe be better explained as this kind of literary idea that probably someone learned in school or they learned from reading these quote unquote classic texts or part of the intellectual canon of the age. And so if you know that this happens in Homer, and Virgil certainly picks it up, then no surprise, I think that you find it in the Gospels as well.
And how did the Gospels change how early Christians understand Jesus?
Well, I think by the time you get into the 2nd century and the Gospels, I mean, it's still a moving target for quite a long time, actually. But let's go 2nd century for the Gospels that we know, the canonical ones being the ones that sort of coalesce, again, to use that language, into an authoritative set of documents. I think it did a few things. By putting the Synoptic Gospels together, you reinforced a particular account of Jesus's biography, and one that wasn't as esoteric as something like the Gospel of John, not as esoteric as some of the non-canonical Gospels that some of you may have looked at in the past, or even, something like the Gospel of Thomas, which was just a saying source, which we did later find, obviously. There are some aspects in there where you wouldn't necessarily expect Jesus to be talking about murdering people, right? Or talking about, like the kingdom of heaven being like a man who kills another man, or that he's going to turn Mary into a male. Those kinds of claims, I think, were a lot for people to process. So I think that with the Synoptics in particular, you have more or less the same story repeated several times. So what I see there are authors citing each other or in conversation with one another. The Gospel of John, too, to a limited extent, it has different stories in it, but it also maintains that same structure for an account of Jesus. And so I think that gave people a sense of an authorized history that they could actually help explain that gap between Jesus's lifetime and when Paul starts to write. And you had sort of a problem in early Christianity that the earliest something that was written down that people could exchange and think about and debate in a shared way, because it could be more mobile. And you could actually have a conversation with the text as somebody, if you were able to read and write, or even just to be able to read to a group to discuss the ideas within it, I mean, to have Paul being circulated, his letters circulated, and he didn't even know the historical Jesus. Of course, for Paul, he's worried about Christ. He's not worried about the historical man or his teachings. But as time went on, especially when you get to the 2nd century, you need some kind of account of the life of the hero, like we were just talking about. You need some kind of account of who Jesus was, what were the things that he said and he did that made him so remarkable and worthy of this attention. And you already have the literary precursors there to know how to do it. You know what kind of teachings, whether they're part of oral tradition or not, but you know what kind of philosophical positions to take, what's popular at the time, Platonism, Stoicism, to have Jesus take on those characteristics in his teachings. You know what kind of wonder working he's going to probably perform. You have the Stoic model of what's going on with the spirit, with pneuma, to explain its action in human history, the expectations for Christ that are outlined so well by Paul, and then I would say replicated in various ways within the Gospels. As a piece, all of that together was enough, I think, for people to feel as though they had enough of a storied history, even though it had been a short period of time since Jesus's life. And then also, of course, all of this is reflected in the Hebrew Bible as well for early Christians, which is far more ancient and heralded as such and respected as such. All of that together created that authorized history for early Christians. Yeah, I'm looking at the comments and somebody said Mark had to look in Paul's letters to come up with things for his Jesus. I completely agree. I'm one of the people who think that Mark definitely read Paul, because the way pneuma functions in Paul is exactly the same. And so I think you had there an ability to take Paul's letters and sort of create an image of what Jesus was like in his historical moment.
What do you think the goal was of the gospel writers when they were trying to rewrite the historical Jesus, embellish him? What was the point of it? Why put him in the Greco-Roman milieu?
Well, he had to be able to compete with the other figures out there, right? And I sometimes don't love the language of competition. I think it can be overdone. But I think that it's helpful to think about it in terms of competition, insofar as, like, you can see it in the Gospels, this attempt to say, this figure of Jesus has all the characteristics that you would expect from a god or a hero or another great figure for whom we have other biographies in antiquity. And I have another piece on this that's actually a new version of it is in the book that you mentioned, the very last chapter on subversive biography. Because whether it's Alexander the Great or Plato, or, there's this one book called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, right? Diogenes Laertius. You have these accounts of these great figures, statesmen, etc., the lives of the Caesars, where there's always a few things that happen, not all the time, but in some combination, you're going to have a remarkable birth narrative. Sometimes it turns out, David Litwa has written about this too, is like sometimes it turns out in Alexander's birth narrative that like some god snuck into his mother's bedroom, right? Like you're going to have in some way a reference to some kind of special birth or special kind of lineage. And so you're going to have that somewhere. You're going to have the person be remarkable as a child. Again, not every biography is going to have this. So even if we look at the Gospels, you have to wait till Matthew and Luke to get the baby Jesus story. But you're going to have some kind of claim that he was the smartest kid, almost always a he. He was the smartest kid in the school. He was better than his teacher. Alexander the Great, smarter than Aristotle, right? Jesus, smarter than any of the rabbis in the temple at 12 years old. So there's going to be some kind of remarkable aspect there. Some of you may have seen in the news last week, they were claiming that they found an early text of Jesus's childhood. What all that was the infancy gospel of Thomas, for which we have many, many copies. But there too, even though I would say it's a little bit more of a satire, it too is talking about, Jesus kind of going through a maturation process, but always a remarkable infant and a young person coming of age. That always happens. Then you're going to have some remarkable events over the course of time for this individual, showcasing that they have special abilities. I'll go back to Alexander just because it's easy, but Alexander the Great, he can't perform miracles per se, like healing miracles, for example, but he learns potions, and he gets so good at it that he can heal any of his friends. So any of his friends get sick, he has such a mastery of this art that he can heal them through his ability to make medicines. Jesus healing his friends. Infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus's playmates, one I think gets bitten by a snake, he's able to cure him. Another falls from a roof and dies, he's able to resurrect, right? So you get the idea. If I just start with that you have a certain number of benchmarks that you want your major figure to hit. Jesus needed to hit those for a variety of reasons, both because he's already being respected, obviously, as this special character. And so people are going to be like, so tell me about his story. Where did he come from? But in telling that story, you have to show that he's on par with other figures that people revere and respect.
I'd like to ask real quick about the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Like, what else do we know about it? Like, when does it date? Like that little manuscript that they found.
So the manuscript they found, I think they're trying to date to the 2nd century. I have to admit that the headlines were all so bad that I was like sort of at pains to click on it. I knew what it was about. I clicked on one and looked at it. Now, I think the date that I remember scholars have already dated that text to is around 125. So I'll give you that as kind of like the earliest you could possibly claim. What I remember about, again, just kind of speed reading and being like, oh, I can't believe they gave this headline. We've known about this text forever. Was that in this particular manuscript, the script hand was sort of either rushed or didn't look that professional, and so people had always just assumed that this was a receipt or something, maybe a letter, but it just looked like it was a non-professional hand forming the letters, and so it had been kind of overlooked. And then I guess somebody noticed the word Jesus on the page, and they started to translate it, and lo and behold, you had the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and so that made news just because it's a text that I don't think most people have heard of. I like it quite a bit because Jesus is sort of evil, which is a humorous take, especially for a 2nd century text where I mentioned he has a maturation process, but part of that is, if somebody pisses him off and, I have a 5-year-old, if someone pushes him in the playground or in the marketplace or whatever in the text, he'll just kill the kid. And so over time, he kills enough kids for making him mad that the parents of the town go to Joseph and Mary and they're like, can you do something about this? And so there's something very real about the text. He eventually gets framed for what was truly an accident for another playmate. And so that triggers a turnaround for him. And he starts to realize he should be using his powers for good. And then the text at that pivot point, or at least how I see it, takes a turn that you would expect, which is then all of a sudden Jesus as a child starts doing things that are going to augur things that he's going to do in the Gospels. And so I think there's a multiplication scene. I think as well, there might have been a turning water into wine kind of situation. Basically, it starts to mirror the kind of miracles that you can expect in the Gospels. So again, the childhood mirroring what you're going to see with the adult later. It is totally a Jesus comic. Yeah. Would have made a great graphic novel.
Yeah. What do you think the goal of that person was that created that text? Like some sort of dark humor maybe, or what? Like what's going on there?
Well, there are these kind of cradle to grave biographies in antiquity, and you have to admit, you get the genealogy and Jesus in the temple, and you get the whole Charlie Brown, Snoopy Christmas, nativity in the canonical Gospels, but that's about it. That was a pretty wide lane for somebody to step into. And the idea of sort of the precocious child, in the end, it's quite a faithful text in the sense that it shows you and models how he comes to realize that his role as Messiah, etc. But I think that this playful take, there's a term for some of these stories in ancient stories where it's the idea of like the child man. So the word in Latin is senex for like old man. So like the child old man. So you want to show that he's actually quite self-possessed as a child, even when he's like killing people. But I think it was an interesting idea for this author to say it's a theological statement about when does he get his theological or his, son of God powers. If you read the Gospel of Mark, he's not the son of God until he's baptized. What this text is saying, it's actually making a Christological statement, which is that he always had those powers. And so I think that's one of those natural questions. If he were born the son of God from Mary's womb and already has all of these powers that you're telling us that he had as an adult to heal, to resurrect, to multiply, etc., then how did he handle that as a kid? Did they like online one day, or did he always have them? I mean, that's a true theological problem. So I imagine the author of this text was sorting it out, but sorting it out in a way, again, with attention to the maturation process of children. It's quite interesting.
Were Christians prior to the composition of the Gospels already heavily influenced by Greco-Roman literature such as Paul or maybe the author of the Q source?
Sure. I mean, we've talked about some of the sort of extra Christian texts that were probably in their wheelhouse just because of how they've been educated, or things that they were going to want to emulate just to show that they were great writers. But, the Q source issue is one that I've managed to kind of successfully dodge for a few years. I mean, a lot of scholars that I really respect, so like John Kloppenborg, Stan Stour, Sarah Rollins, these, or Bill Arnall, I mean, they think the Q source is real. And so I don't tend to, or at least a very strong hypothesis, Mark Goodacre, right? Although he's made some interesting arguments along those lines too. But I think that some kind of saying source is a reasonable assumption, that there would have been some kind of collection possibly of teachings that have gone around. And whether that was written or oral, again, I want to think more about this as my career goes on. But I mean, there's the Gospel of Thomas, of course. But even beyond that, I mean, Paul mentions some of Jesus's teachings. Now, some of them by way of the Lord mean things that he claims the resurrected Jesus is saying to him. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth. I'm not necessarily saying that a saying source would be legitimate, authentic sayings of Jesus. They could be things that people claim a resurrected Christ are telling them in the way that Paul does. So we have to consider that. But the idea that they would have had some kind of saying source written down, circulating, I don't have a big problem with that. And again, many scholars I respect have debated this issue and seem to think that kind of Occam's razor Q makes a lot of sense. But I think the primary thing is the letters of Paul. I think that Paul's being able to write things down. And again, he's the first one that we know of who did that. And also his strong engagement with philosophy. So he's not just making kind of a rando claim about a Christ figure just purely based on his own interpretation of the Hebrew Bible or based on revelation. He's doing it in such a way that if you read him in the Greek, he's really reflecting Stoic and Platonic thought. Another author who's written about this is Emma Wasserman. She wrote a book on the death of the soul in Paul and how it reflects a tripartite soul and death of the soul that you find in Plato. And then, of course, I've talked about pneuma with you before as this Stoic concept that's actually like a physical substance that links people together. And a person who's written quite elegantly on this too is Stanley Stowers. I actually let me do a quick promo for him because his book is right here. He just came out with a book called Christian Beginnings, which is a compilation of a bunch of articles he's written. And he has an article on the participation of Christ, which talks about this language, and he talks about pneuma throughout. And so I think when you know that, it was almost like food for thought for people to reflect on. what Paul was talking about, because to some degree what he was saying was, I wouldn't say controversial, but it was certainly intellectually stimulating. And so I think that those letters circulated in pieces or in fragments. There was a lot there for people to debate, both interpretations of Hebrew Bible and philosophical ideas. And then eventually the framework around those ideas became the Gospels once it was clear that a biography of Jesus was needed.
Let's take a couple of super chats. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. What was the Gospel of Mark to the people adding and doing other stuff to it? Just a regular book or inspired scripture?
That's a great question too. I'm not sure at the time that the Gospels were written they were inspired scripture necessarily. The reason I say that is, it's hard for me to interpret the claims of an author along those lines. Luke makes something of a claim along those lines in the preface, where he says that, he's talked to people who from the beginning were servants of the word, and word there, logos, is, philosophical idea. The reason I hedge on this a little is that a lot of people make claims along these lines, right? That whatever they're doing is inspired in the best. I mean, almost every author does that. That's kind of what you have to do. And so whether or not these people actually thought what they were doing was recording the inspired speech, the sayings of Jesus, the events of his life, that worries me less than how it was later used. And certainly it was later used that way, and to great effect for the power brokers of early Christianity. So here I'm thinking about the 2nd century and beyond. So Mark, people adding to it, I mean, that's what people do. This is the other thing, right? And this is the problem with inspired scripture being some kind of an idea of like a pristine document, because human beings are a mess. And anything that's mediated through human beings, we have to expect like hubris and bias, and ego is going to come into all of it. And so I think when people messed with text, some of it was a mistake, like a legit mistake by a scribe who like kind of falls asleep and accidentally repeats a line, right? Or it can be later actors who find something inconvenient about a text, or like maybe they got into a fight with somebody and they were trying to like prove their point, right? So, I mean, this is what the Deutero-Paulines are, right? People trying to write in Paul's name to enact some idea that they have later on of what's necessary for the quote unquote Christian community. So I think that when we find variations in text, or we find additions, or manipulations, that says more about us than it says about the authors, the quote unquote original author, or the intention of the text itself, which is why I'm so interested in how they're later used, not so much what the intentions were at the time, because we've screwed that up. The example I like to give of this, just to kind of solidify this idea that there are human hands in this and things change, is the adulterous woman, the story of the adulterous woman. First of all, that is not Mary Magdalene. That was a conclusion of a later pope. I want to say it was Pope Leo, but someone can, double check me on this. But that was a conclusion, a later interpretation that had nothing to do with the original intentions of the text. But moreover, that adulterous woman passage was not original to the Gospel of John. From what I understand, it was actually found in the Gospel of Luke at various points, and looks like it was written by some kind of scribe or somebody in the margin of the text. And then it eventually makes its way into the Gospel of John through the process of collation and circulation of the Gospels. So the willingness of people to invent a little story about Jesus that seemed to be exemplary of his character, and sort of, move it around and manipulate it into the Gospels. I mean, that's what humans do. So I find the work of Brett Nongbree really interesting in this area, because he talks quite a bit about ancient texts. He had a book called God's Library that I think a lot of people would enjoy, that's very accessible. So if you take a look at some of the manuscript history, it's quite interesting, and it starts to give you a much different view of the sacredness of these documents, at least in terms of how they were treated.
TELENIKON, thank you for your super chat. Why do you suppose Mark shows the apostles not getting or understanding the message Jesus was trying to get across? Do you plan to release an audible version?
I'll start with the second part first. I asked them and I volunteered to just do it, to read the book, to an audiobook, and they told me no. So sorry. I guess it's very, very expensive to produce. So I did my part. I made the proposal, but I guess it's just not something that university presses usually do. But I think someday I'll write a popular book, so maybe we'll get there if you can stand listening to my voice for that long. Why do you suppose Mark shows the apostles not getting or understanding the message? I think that it was part of this, what I've argued in this forthcoming piece, this kind of thalma presentation. So the hero as a thalma, so as a wonder. So the word thalma, I saw somebody mention in the comments, like maybe I was saying Thelma, but thalma. So THAUMA. So that is the word in Greek for wonder. And so the kind of baffling presentation of these people and what they're doing and how miraculous and bizarre and subversive at times what they're doing is a thing that causes basically confusion and wonderment and the observers. And so I think when he shows the apostles not getting or understanding, I think you're supposed to relate to the apostles as a reader, frankly. I think, you too are going along for this ride of revelation, meaning you know who the guy is, right? And so you're kind of in on the secret, but when you're with the apostles who are the disciples who are trying to understand what they're seeing and participating in, and they're not even quite sure why they're following, they're on a journey of discovery that I think helps the reader go along with that journey as well. And what's interesting about that to me too is if you imagine somebody picking it up who's not already a Christian, right? Is this document actually aimed towards non-Christians in that respect? I mean, there's some good debates you could have about that, right? That you are like the disciples in that text, in that he keeps doing these things and you're not quite sure who this guy is. And again, that text starts with, you don't get that baby story. You don't know that, he was God's son from conception and, the three wise men, et cetera, smarter than, the teachers. You don't have any of that with Mark. The dove, the pneuma, comes down from the dove at the baptism. And the person baptizing is a figure you probably have heard of, John the Baptist, right? Everybody knew who John the Baptist was. So here is this hallowed figure who is reducing himself, in a sense, to say that you could say he's either passing the torch to Jesus, but he is recognizing Jesus as greater than himself. And you're like, who is this guy? And then throughout the text, you're just sort of confused. And it's an interesting play, right? It's very sophisticated until you have that fulcrum, that turn where Peter recognizes who Jesus is and Jesus is like, shut up, right? And after that point is when, some people call it kind of a long death march with intro to it, which is a little bit crude, but I understand why people put it that way because the passion takes up the rest of that text. So it's an interesting way that it's structured. And I think that you're supposed to identify with the disciples in that structure.
John D., thank you for your super chat. Could you share your thoughts on the rolling open text model of gospel formation as conceived of by Litway and Larson? Can we discern a single author's voice?
Yeah, so I talk about Larson's work in the book, but his book, I know he talks about the Gospels as being kind of a series of notebooks almost, that this idea of the rolling open text model that people are sort of sampling and adding and subtracting to it. Can we discern a single author's voice? I'm not so worried about individual words necessarily being the original. I don't obsess with original, actually. I guess I could just make it even simpler. I don't obsess with that too much, but the idea of a single author's voice, I think that each one of those texts is cohesive enough in terms of approach, terminology, and general perspective on the nature of Christ or on Jesus's activity, especially when you think about how, if Mark is the earliest, how Matthew and Luke make choices on what to do with Mark. There's too much, I think, weighing on the side of there being a, what we might call single author's voice, but more of a cohesive viewpoint on how to approach the subject matter, that I feel confident enough talking about a text that is more discernible, to use your language, of an author. I also, this gets into some of the philosophical ideas of what's an author, which is maybe a little too far afield for us today. But, you know, like when I write my own book, there are multiple people involved in it, right? But there's still kind of my voice coming through, even if there were people who helped me edit, or like came in and told me I can't use this term, can use that term. I mean, it happens all the time. I got proofs for something a couple of days ago and they were telling me, we're going to tell you can't use this phrase, right? And I, you know, of course, got up in arms about it, blah, blah, blah. But this kind of thing happens all the time. And so whether it's a product of debate, whether it's a product of later editorial voices coming in, this also gets to what I was saying before, how do people treat it? And certainly people were treating the canonical gospels anyway, with some of those exceptions like the adulterous woman passage, but as authoritative voices in their own right. I think the idea of something like a notebook is really creative and interesting. I'm not sure what Litwa has written along these lines. I've read a lot of his work, maybe not everything, not some of his later antiquity stuff, but I wasn't as convinced by that argument, and it's not a reflection on these scholars at all. But it doesn't seem to me to fit that kind of genre presentation. I think these are biographies. And I don't think that they're sort of like the open text collaborative sort of works that we see maybe elsewhere that they have argued about. But I am not sure what Litwa has argued along those lines. I've only remembered Larson.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. One thing for sure, these gospel writers didn't understand Jewish laws and culture, not to mention the Old Testament can't even get the day he died correct.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the gospel that, is it Mark, where there's this whole line like, and then they wash their hands because Pharisees wash their hands. It was like somebody trying to prove to you something that they learned for the first time. I think it was Mark. And I haven't had my coffee yet, so it's not generating fast enough. Maybe it'll come to me in a second which passage it is.
There is something in Mark chapter 7 about.
Is it? It's Mark, right? Yeah, but there's this passage that's said, and you're like, thanks. Like, I didn't need that. Thanks. But it just kind of sounds like somebody like telling you something they've learned for the first time. So yeah, certainly there are aspects. I mean, Matthew does a good job citing the Hebrew Bible, right? I still think Matthew has Stoic elements to it strongly. Matthew also gets kind of like creeped out by a lot of the like demon stuff. He takes a lot of that out, which is interesting. So, you know, get back to this idea, do you have a single author? I mean, there are just these strong characteristics of each one of these texts. But yeah, this there's definitely conflict in terms of some of the basics from the Hebrew Bible. What is that a product of? Is it a product of disagreements, variant readings, having a bad copy of your Septuagint, Paul getting something wrong and you're relying on him? I mean, there are a lot of different ways to approach that, but that's why, you know, we all like this topic, like this subject matter. But yeah, I agree with you. They're not the best.
How are the Gospels a subversive biography?
So the argument that I made there with the scholar David Constant, a classicist, there was an article and then I adapted that article for the book and expanded on it there, is that what you usually expect with a biography of a great statesman, a hero, whatever, emperor, is that it's going to be more or less flattering, right? That it's going to put the person in a good light, and that they're going to be the strongest, the best, the bravest, etc. And for the most part, you do get that. But what you do start to get in the biographical tradition around the time of imperial literature is a subversion of that, where your hero is kind of an underdog, or the hero you wouldn't expect, or kind of appealing for like anti-hero reasons. So, for example, you have two biographies of Alexander that I think represent two different tracks. You have that traditional, like Plutarch, sort of like he was the best, the bravest. Occasionally he'll admit like he was a drunk, but this is the guy smarter than Aristotle, can tame a horse that nobody else can tame, best, bravest mind, best mind, military mind ever. Then you have something called the Alexander Romance that emerges, which is essentially a biography as well, novelistic biography, where Alexander is not that attractive. He gets by on his wits, not so much his physical abilities. He's just very clever, and so he can sort of trick people or kind of beat them at their own game that way. And so that kind of created a permission structure to write something along the lines where you do have that anti-hero figure. So another example would be Aesop. So the life of Aesop. Aesop is enslaved, formerly enslaved. He's supposed to be not that attractive, but he's very clever, right? So he still manages to like get the girl, get the attention, get the accolades, even though it's not from his brawn and his bravery per se, or his attractiveness. And so you have a lot of different examples along these lines. And I think the Gospels sort of fit into that, because you don't expect your Messiah to die, right? You don't expect this savior figure to come to the end that he comes to at the hands of the Romans. And also, he's not from an aristocratic background. He may be like divinely aristocratic, but he's coming from the Galilee of all places. And it's almost like, to the extent that we have information about the historical Jesus, it's sort of, if there was common knowledge about him, that he's coming from Judea, from the outskirts of the empire, particularly from a place that is known to be more of a rural setting, that already kind of sets the predicate that your guy is going to be subversive. He's not royal. He's not a general. He's not part of any of those traditional power structures. And so I feel that kind of set the tone that, okay, if we're going to write a biography of this guy, especially given just the basic facts, it's going to be one of these subversive biographies where he is going to get his followers, or get through his narrative by the power of his word, through the power of his actions, through his cleverness, and through his ability to kind of trump the system. And so I think that is the best way for me to describe the arc that I see, or kind of the genre shift that I see.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Robyn Walsh.
Oh, yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, I want to remind everybody to go get her book. The link to the History Valley Amazon affiliate link is in the description below. It's in the pinned comment live chat, and it will also be in the pinned comment below, in the comments below this video. Thanks again.
Yep, anytime.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.